I grew up in a place where they told you what to chase, told you how to run the race. Every move was on the page, but I didn't like their way. Had to fight and misbehave, had to find a way to change, had to leave to find my way.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 1 of Gamble, the high-stakes game of life. My name is TJ Lasig. I'll be your host here on this brand new podcast where we're going to be talking all things sports, poker, entrepreneurship, and pretty much everything in between. Because when it comes down to it, this game of life we are all playing is really nothing but one big gamble. Joining me as my co-host here is my best friend and partner in crime, Jim Recupero, aka Coop. Some of you may know Coop from our work together at Own the Moment these past couple of years, but Coop and I actually go way back beyond that for over 15 years now, back to our college days. And there's really no one out there that knows more about my personal journey than this guy, which makes him the perfect co-host here on this new podcast. Coop, what's going on, my friend?
I'm doing great, man. I am really excited to get this show going and to share some wild and crazy stories that we have into the public world. For a long time, I've been following you around along for the ride on many of your endeavors, all of which we're going to cover on this show. And I'd say I'm a more simple-minded person, so I'm excited to get into your brain and unpack it a bit more. This world of gambling and how we define the word gamble and the high stakes game of life. So really excited to be here and excited to chop it up with you.
Yeah, for sure. It's been like, I don't know, probably 15 years now of me playing around in these various spaces, from poker, fantasy sports, Own the Moment, running a business the last 4 years. And we'll talk about all that kind of stuff on this show. And I feel like over the years, I have a lot of thoughts, ideas, strategies, hot takes, whatever you want to call it. And I typically am one to keep most of those thoughts to myself, unless you're find yourself hanging out with me at 2 a.m. late night one night. So this provides a little bit of a forum to share some of those things more publicly. And on this first episode here, going to be a high-level introduction to the show and the different types of topics, examples that we may be covering on this podcast series. Also going to share more about my personal background, Coop's personal background, the origin story, and a little bit of that. And then we're going to give some little teasers of what's to come. Hopefully hook all you viewers in to make you want to continue listening to the episodes over time. So yeah, this one's going to be probably touching on a bunch of things at a high level, mostly in the worlds of poker, fantasy sports, and business. And then in future episodes, we'll dive deeper and deeper into some of the specific topics, some of the specific stories.
For those of you that know TJ, my job here on the show is to bring out a little bit of that 2 a.m. TJ and share a little bit of that with the world. And for those that don't know TJ, or just getting to know TJ and getting to know 2 a.m. TJ are slightly different individuals. I'll say slightly different individuals. But yeah, the world of poker and fantasy sports, and following you and mostly kind of following behind you in those things, has really just been incredibly interesting from my point of view. I think, to introduce myself a little further, when it comes to these kind of things, I would say I'm pretty simple-minded. Like I said, I would simply call them gambling. And I think one of the most interesting things about you, TJ, is you hate the word gambling, which is a very fun way to kind of play yin and yang on this podcast, because I think, I don't want to call the world simple-minded, but I'd say 95% of the world, of the people at least listening to this, would simply call these activities gambling. And then when you think about fantasy sports and poker and running a business, you ultimately have to start to wonder, well, how does someone continue to win? Because if you continue to win, then it's clearly not just gambling. So I really think it's going to be fun to unpack a lot of the stories, to dive deep into how you think about things, and to challenge myself here a little bit and continue to change the way and how I think about these things.
It is funny because the title of the podcast is indeed gamble, but you're right. Not a big fan of the word gambling or gamble. I don't actually consider myself a gambler per se because I prefer to play games of skill, games of strategy, and I think that the way you can think about games like poker, like fantasy sports, peer-to-peer games where you're trying to basically take in information. It's games of imperfect information, and you're trying to make decisions based on potential outcomes and probabilities. And all of those same concepts can be applied to anything in life. And I think that's one of the themes that you'll hear on this show is thinking probabilistically and thinking about things like range of outcomes and variance. And in my opinion, too many people in this world think very much in black or white, right? Something is either right or wrong. It's this or it's that. But almost nothing is actually like that. Instead, there could be an 80% chance that this thing is right, but there could be a 20% chance that it's also wrong. And so I'm the way I think about things, I'll pretty much never speak in absolutes, or at least think in absolutes, because everything is a percentage at the end of the day. And playing these games over the years has taught me that. I mean, nothing teaches you what an 80% outcome is like more than getting your pocket aces cracked by pocket eights, right, Coop?
The worst, man. Poker is the best game and the ultimate worst game all at the same time. And nothing keeps you quite alive more than a game like poker. So I'm excited to hear more. I said this previously to TJ, but many people have said this in the past and have told me that the world is all math. And it never made sense. As someone who is relatively good at math and understands it, I never really thought of the world in that way until I've opened myself up to, joining in business with you and understanding how you think a little bit more. And it really is. Almost every decision that you make, especially every big decision that you make in life, comes down to some sort of element of probability. And you can simply try to put yourself in the best spots in a lot of facets of life, such that is akin to a game like poker or a game like fantasy sports. So I really think it dovetails really well into some of the topics we'll get into in the show.
Absolutely. And I'd say three things to keep a lookout for on this intro episode in particular, but also just general themes that will recur on future episodes of the show is, number one, learning games like we were talking about here, like poker, like fantasy sports, as I said, can teach you a lot of skills that can be applied to pretty much any aspect of your life. And I think even just the process of thinking about the games can make you smarter. Number two, this idea of winning and losing and swings. Nothing teaches you about the swings of life more than putting skin in the game in some of these gambling games. And I'm a firm believer that success is not always straight up and to the right. There's going to be losses along the way. And every time you lose at something, you're going to learn something, and it sets you up to be able to win bigger down the line. So we'll get into some of my losses over the years that in the short term seem horrible, but like I really think that having these losses really does set you up to have bigger wins later on in your life. And then lastly, number three, which is kind of a similar concept, but life journeys, career journeys in general are not linear. And when I look back on my life, there's all these dots that have kind of connected and led me to where I am today. But you don't know that those dots are even on the board when you're in the moment. So it's all about putting you in yourself in the right positions. And over time, like as we're going to get into kind of my origin story here, but my story is essentially that I had an interest in poker from the time I was in middle school. That interest in poker led me into an interest in fantasy sports, and specifically competitive daily fantasy sports on sites like FanDuel and DraftKings. This was back in like 2012. That opened up an opportunity where I was able to work at Roto Grinders and get into content, podcasting, writing articles for the first time. And then that led to the ability to start the company Own the Moment that we've been working on for the past 4 years, and also start other podcasts and content journeys such as this one. So in any individual one of those moments over the course of my life, there was never really a master plan. There was never this intentional like stepping stones. But when I look back on it, it's kind of easy to see things that way. So I think it's interesting. And, you know, Coop, I think you as much as anyone are a supporter of and have the experience of just staying in the mix, keeping yourself in the game, and seeing where it takes you from there.
Yeah, most certainly. I think I'm a big yes guy. If something piques my interests, I'm pretty quick to say yes and figure out how to make things happen. And I know in the world today, a lot of things you might listen to or hear is learning to say no more. But I found that if you're really interested in something, trying to say yes more to those things and no to things that don't interest you or aren't appealing to you is the give and take that you need to have there. But I've always been a yes man. I've tried as much as possible to take on things in my life where I have an interest and try to just learn more. I would consider myself, a little bit of my background, as like really a traditional generalist, someone who dabbles in many different things, but hasn't really found the niche that I have a desire to master quite yet. And being 35, turning 36 relatively soon, I've come to realize I might never find the niche that I want to master, and I'm okay with that. I think it's the kind of personality that I have, and it's simply the way in which my brain computes how life happens, I guess. I would say from a gambling perspective, because I would simply call it gambling, I'm probably a bit more on the fishy side than the sharp side. I'm mostly a kind of guy who just wants to have a good sweat, get some action in. And until I met TJ, I never even really thought that much about how to improve, how to get better, or even the concept of getting better. I think I always took in the fact that people were good, but I never really understood or dug deep to find out why they're good, how they get good, and things like that. And that's a lot of the things that TJ and his journey have taught me. And yeah, that's a bit about myself. I guess just a note. TJ and I, as you said, have been running a startup for the last 4 years. So I'm kind of his right-hand man in the startup. I have a fancy title of COO that I simply just like to push along. So it's fun. It's fun to just say you're COO.
C-suite executive, baby.
Exactly. C-suite executive. And yeah, I've been great friends with TJ for more than a decade now, pushing 20 years, I think. So I think we have a ton of stories to share across the gambling perspective, and it'll be fun to share.
Yeah, Coop was Captain Coop of our hockey team at Penn State back in the day, and we've never lived in the same city. I live in Philly. Coop lives in Pittsburgh, but I mean, for 15 years now, it's probably been hard pressed to find, definitely not a week, let alone a day, where we haven't talked in some way over text or Slack. And yeah, sometimes you just meet those people and you're just, Coop's always, whenever I have one of my crazy ideas or thoughts or whatever, Coop's always my number one go-to person, especially when my wife gets tired of hearing about all my shit. I'll take it to Coop instead.
I'm here for you, man. I'm here for you.
You said a couple things there though that actually I think segue nicely into some of the like broad categories, if you will, that we plan to cover on this podcast. I'd say there's kind of 3 main buckets. Number one is this general gambling concepts and specifically thinking like a sharp gambler. Coop mentioned how himself, lots of people out there are just like purely gambling without knowing what's going on. And that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that too. I think that understanding that you're doing that is different than just like not even knowing that you're blindly throwing darts, if that makes sense. So it's not like pure gambling is a bad thing, but I think being aware of when you're getting your money in good, when you're getting it bad, or just understanding the game that you're playing is important. So we'll talk about all the different concepts within that. And then number 2 is just more general life theories and kind of hot takes on life that I've discovered over the years. You talked about saying yes to things, and I think that is absolutely something that I am a fan of as well. But I also find that it's interesting, like as you go through journeys, there's, I would say, earlier in my life, saying yes to things is like important because you get that experience. But then eventually, like for me, it gets to a point of like, okay, well now I actually need to learn how to say no to something so that I can pick the 1 or 2 things to focus on. And I feel the same way about like technology and multitasking specifically. I kind of pride myself on being a really good multitasker and being able to do 6 different things at once. But one of the skills that I've actually had to work, and I think that being able to multitask is a good skill to have. But over the past couple of years, I've had to intentionally work on not multitasking and doing things like going for walks without my phone and intentionally disconnecting, and like just how that can swing back and forth. I don't know, lots of random life takes that I have there. And then number 3, probably the most interesting, I know to you, is the untold stories of the past. And maybe we'll give a little bit of teaser of what some of those stories may be.
Yeah, I mean, I'll already challenge you here a little bit on episode 1. If you want to see TJ not be able to multitask, simply try to have a conversation with him or say anything or get him to hear anything at all when he's text messaging. It's literally like he is in a bubble. The world does not exist. It is only that singular message that is happening. So just pointing out where you're telling the truth and where you might be fabricating something.
I have my phone sitting like 6 inches away from me, so gonna not be on the phone on the pod. No slacking. Podcast, we got to be fully focused. But yeah, I'm pretty much always having 2 or 3 different conversations at once via the phone and via in person. So yeah, my college roommates can attest to it. My wife can attest to it. I don't hear anything in the real world going around me when I'm dialed in on the phone. That's a funny one. All right,
yeah, let's all right, go ahead.
No. What were you gonna say?
I was gonna say I think we need to give a little teaser, a laundry list, if you will, of a few of the stories that will be unfolded on this podcast.
Read my mind. All right, I got a list of some things here. No particular order, really. Well, actually, somewhat bucketed. So, wins. Right, we're going to cover stories of some big wins. I've got my first $10,000 win, which was in fantasy sports. Then I've got my first $100,000 win, also in fantasy sports, and has happened in poker as well.
I'm pretty sure he was asleep on the couch for one of the $100,000 wins.
That is
there
correct.
In fantasy sports.
Literally,
We'll get into that.
Literally correct. Just got too sweaty for me to handle, and yeah, we'll get into that. I got the night you and I pulled in a collective, I think $10K playing blackjack, which was an epic night.
I'm pretty confident we had no idea how much money we had, and they were like, "Hey, I think
I'm gonna round up to 10K no matter what."
I think it's like 6 a.m. and it was the night before New Year's Eve, and we had to leave the casino. Had no clue that it was light outside. Had absolutely no clue. Walked outside as if it were in Vegas, and it was not Vegas. Everybody, it was not Vegas.
No. And I'm actually I'm retired from blackjack now, so it'll be good to reflect on the glory days. I used to like the game of blackjack back in the day. So those
I'm
are
definitely not retired from blackjack. Absolutely not retired.
I think knowing how to play blackjack is a great game and case study that we'll do a blackjack episode one of these days for sure. All right, so then I got some losses because you can't just have wins without the losses. But I've got I had the best year of my fantasy sports career right before COVID happened. And so I was sitting on all this fresh money. And so I dusted off a bunch of money during COVID playing stupid ass games like, I don't know, fantasy MMA, fantasy esports at one time. I was in way over my head. There's been plenty of times where I look back at myself, whether was in some early online poker stuff or some fantasy sports stuff, and I'm like, man, I was the mark in that game. Good to know. Don't want to be that guy again in the future. And then, Coop, I think you know about this one, or maybe you don't remember, but my DraftKings account got hacked and
Oh
some
yeah.
guy stole 50K from me
Oh yeah.
slowly without me even noticing. That's how hashtag rich
Locked
my
in.
bankroll was. Ben locked in.
How
there
rich
was.
and how locked in.
Didn't even know that I was slowly getting hacked for 50K over the course of a couple weeks. So that's a story. And then we'll talk near and dear to our hearts, but NBA Top Shot, sinking like 30K plus into that. We'll talk some Top Shot too. I know some of our OTM people can relate to the 2021 craziness of NBA Top Shot. Some good times there, and then just many other stories that Coop and I have over the years that I'm sure I'm not even thinking of. Business stories from OTM, behind the scenes stuff that's gone on, working 2 jobs for a long period of time. Plenty of stories, but hopefully that gives a little bit of a peek of what people can expect here, Coop. Any that stick out to you that I didn't mention on the list that you're hoping to hear from?
Yeah, I think there's a few business, what I'll call as roller coasters. We're on the current business journey and continuing to try to challenge ourselves personally. And TJ is always really good at making me think about how I think about my own personal brand and what he's doing with his brand and things like that. So that's a little bit of the reason for this podcast, but the business journeys, the ups and downs of starting a business from scratch. I mentioned it earlier in the podcast. I have the fancy COO title, but the whole entire business from my perspective came down to a simple question in a Slack channel of, hey, does anyone want to help us produce a podcast? And I was like, yeah. In high school, I did some production stuff. I've always been really interested in content and the behind the scenes of content. And I had to set a simple yes to producing a podcast. And that led to a journey of helping to run a multi-million-dollar startup that we've successfully put together over the course of the last couple of years. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about the business ups and downs, but I've got a couple other personal stories, personal wins and losses. We'll dive deep into how a $10,000 win for me, which I've only got 2 5-figure wins in my career, how a $10,000 win quickly turned into a $4,000 win, all due to the fancy game of blackjack. So I'll establish a little bit of my grounds as the degenerate on the podcast, the guy who's simply just getting it in and sweating it out and being more of that common man, I guess, as you will, as something of an example of what you might not want to do in some cases. So I'm excited to share some of those details.
Oh yeah. Plenty of lessons learned, plenty of times where we did smart things, plenty of times where we both did very dumb things, but hey, that's the beauty of life and beauty of the journey. So let's Coop kind of gave a good summary there of where the story kind of not ended but sits today with Own the Moment and the business and how we ended up there. But let's rewind all the way real quick, just do a quick kind of run through. For me, it all started with poker, like literally 20 years ago, playing poker with my buddies. I feel like a lot of people our age were into that back then. You go over playing in your buddy's basement, $5 games here and there. So that's where I really got into poker for the first time. And shout out to all my friends. Love you all, but I would win almost every time. Most of the times. They won't play with me anymore, which is smart of them. Like, we haven't had a poker game among my friends in probably 10 years now, because they're just like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to lose. So that was my origin there. And, along that, remember nights of playing online in my bed at home. I remember the first time I won a free roll tournament, which was just like you got to enter in for free. I think I played for like 5 hours and won like $10 or something because I won the tournament. I thought that was the greatest thing ever. Ran that up into a little bit of a bankroll. I feel like I'm an interesting use case in both poker and fantasy sports because I wasn't in the mega early group of people. Like, I was always kind of like just behind, and part of it was my timing in life. Like, I never had the life bankroll to be the Tom Dwan that ran it up from like the millions of dollars or whatever. And I always like made decent money, but I wasn't like making professional level money. And I feel like there's many stories out there of the people that made the $50 deposit and became a professional poker player, and they're still playing it today. And like that was not my story. I kind of always consistently made some money, lost most of it back, kept some. Got some funny stories where like my parents found two $500 checks in my bedroom that were void because you needed to deposit them within 90 days, and I never deposited them. And they're like, really? I was like 18 years old. They're like, really? You just like lit $1,000 on fire? And I'm like, yeah, that's not ideal. But so that was kind of my poker stuff. Then I went off to college. Didn't play too much during college, which was good. I do have some discipline in that sense. Wanted to get the most out of the college experience. I do remember at one point freshman year having hitting $10,000 in my full tilt account, and just like having no idea the value of money and how much money that was. I think I lost like at least half of that back, and then I just like, okay, I'm withdrawing this money and not doing this. Like, this is definitely a bad idea before I run it down to zero. So that was kind of my time in poker. And then after college, we'll get into when I met Justin Herzig, our good buddy and co-founder at Own the Moment. Herzig is pretty much the ultimate giga-brain fantasy sports player, and I was fortunate enough to meet him in my early days working at Capital One right after school, and that's where I got introduced into daily fantasy sports and the idea that you can actually play fantasy sports competitively for money. But yeah, that's kind of my I feel like that's my pre-coup journey essentially, and then the rest picks up from there after I met Justin and we get in the Slack channel that you referenced together. And not going to dive into too many of the details because we'll cover them in future episodes. But one thing that I do want to quickly highlight that I think is going to be the topic of the second episode is the value of being early in some of these things. And I mentioned how like in poker I wasn't super early. Same thing with fantasy sports. I wasn't super early. Like, these guys were making like thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands back in 2013, 2014. I wasn't playing at that level, but missing on two early opportunities twice, to me, led me to be able to actually be early on the NBA Top Shot stuff with Own the Moment and take advantage of it there. So going back to that concept of like, you have to have some losses or some near misses to have the experience to truly be early on something or truly take advantage of something because you've seen it before. Yeah, that's kind of my general spiel there. Hopefully I wasn't too rambly.
No, I think you covered it well. I would say poker definitely, from my perspective, was something that you definitely weren't early on. You knew about poker and didn't really know the level that you were at. But I would say while you weren't in the early days of daily fantasy sports, you were still in the mix prior to where the games became incredibly sharp. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of the arc there. And by no means, don't let TJ fool you all. He was right in the mix, playing at most likely the highest stakes that you could play. I always use this analogy whenever I talk to my wife or some of my friends. I like to say that I have two really good friends that play for 5 figures on a given weekend and sometimes upwards of 6 figures. So in daily fantasy sports, I feel like you are right in the mix. Maybe not in the earliest of mix to be able to maximize the outcome, but certainly we're in the mix and playing at some of the nosebleed stakes, which I think at the end of the day, in order to really be able to talk about this stuff, in order to be really able to share experiences of the highs and lows, I think it always helps when you have that credibility that are playing at those stakes. I played fantasy sports right behind TJ, but never anywhere near those stakes, and still have some great wins, some great stories, some great lessons learned. And I think you can get those things out of these kind of games, except it's certainly a different game when you continue to challenge yourself to step up in stakes and you're taking on people that are thinking about this game not only the same as you, but maybe even at higher levels than you, and learning where you're swimming, essentially in the pond or the lake or the ocean that is fantasy sports. So I think it's important to call out that.
On episode 2, we're going to do a deep dive into the fantasy sports specific stuff, talk about the value of being early, talk about each of our first $10,000 wins and kind of take you more through that. But essentially, fantasy sports started in the early days. I mean, we were early. Like, we were taking advantage of, there were all these new sites that were trying to, and this is what we're going to dive into next episode, but all these new sites that were trying to compete with FanDuel and DraftKings. So there was all kinds of overlay, as they call it, in contests, which was basically free money that was available. So we're pretty much guaranteed wins every single weekend we were playing. Then eventually build up the bankroll, played pretty super high stakes for a year or two. And now, I mean, DFS is another game that I am retired from. I no longer play salary cap daily fantasy sports on DraftKings or FanDuel. I do play on Underdog, however, and I have a portion of the Underdog fantasy world that I believe I am early to, that maybe I'll talk about on the next episode as well. Nothing that I've really shared with anyone, but I've been grinding some of the mega niche portions of the Underdog fantasy app for the past 2 years, and we'll see how it plays out. And I think I'm ready to share that little public journey of that there. But so that was the fantasy side. But really, talk about the dots connecting and all of that. I had this big year where I was doing really well in fantasy, playing at the high stakes, all that kind of stuff. And as a result of that, I had Roto Grinders reach out to me, which anyone that's in the space, Roto Grinders is kind of like the OG content creator of, like, when I first started playing fantasy sports, I would watch Roto Grinder streams like every day, and they have tools, all that kind of stuff. So they reach out to me, and that was my first foray into doing content. I worked at Roto Grinders for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, basically up until Own the Moment started, and did a weekly podcast for both football and for golf, and then a weekly article for both football and golf. So shout out, worked with some cool people over there. The Luch, Justin Carlucci, Tyler Tamboline, Tambo, who's out there starting his own thing now. So met some cool people through that, learned how this whole kind of podcasting content game worked, and all of that ended up culminating in the first time we heard about NBA Top Shot through our friend Jonathan Bales, who was talk about someone that was early into fantasy sports. Jonathan Bales is your guy there, but posted this article about NBA Top Shot. I thought it was super interesting. I thought Bales was super sharp, and that's what led myself, Justin, Coop to start the Own the Moment podcast, which eventually has become much more than that. We'll tell the OTM origin story on another one too, but that's kind of, to me, the full journey there. And again, this concept of the dots connecting over time, having no idea that, playing poker with my buddies in the basement 20 years ago was going to, like, low key build me the skills, interests, all of that networking to eventually be able to start my own company in the tertiary gambling space. So it's been a wild ride, and excited to dive into each specific segment of that journey in various episodes on this very show.
I love it, man. I feel like we're two guys that could riff for quite a while, and it's actually hard to not dive deep into some of these topics. So why don't you help wrap us on episode 1? Talk to the people about when we're going to be coming out with episodes, and ultimately try to put a bow on this first introductory episode to Gamble, the high stakes game of life.
Yes, indeed. All right. So at the end of every episode, I'm going to give kind of my top 3 takes based on what we discussed. So what you're taking away from this show in particular: take number 1, learning gambling adjacent games like poker, fantasy sports can teach you all kinds of skills that can be applied to business and life. We're going to go through those skills on various episodes of this very show. Number 2, sometimes you need to lose in the short term in order to learn how to win even bigger later on. We're going to share various swings, wins, losses, etc. over the course of the show. And then number 3, life paths, journeys are not always linear. The dots, you can't quite connect them until after the fact. And hey, for me, starting this new show is exactly one of those dots. I don't have a specific master plan with why I wanted to start this, with what it's going to do for me. But I figure, A, like Coop said, you and I can chop it up about all kinds of things. We're going to have a fun time doing this. And B, it gives me another dot on the game board that sometime in my future I can connect to some other dots and see where it takes us there. So those are kind of my top 3 takeaways from this first episode from the high level goals of the Gamble High Stakes Game of Life show. We're going to be coming out with episodes every Tuesday. You can make sure you subscribe to the podcast feed. We are on all podcast platforms, and then also on YouTube, new YouTube channel at TJ Lasig. You can see it on the screen here. TJ LAESSIG. Same handle on Twitter /X. And then you can also follow me on Instagram, TJ_Lasig. But keep an eye out every Tuesday, and excited to dive into all this stuff, Coop.
Yeah, man, I'm excited. It's going to be a really fun journey. I'm excited to have fun along the way, enjoy the friendship, open up and share some stories with the world. And talk about taking risks, talk about the life of gambling, if you will.
Yes, indeed. Taking risks, rolling the dice, all that good stuff. Thanks to everyone for listening to episode 1 of the show, and stay gambling.
Caught up in a daydream, I beat my mind up there almost daily. It's how I pass time, no opinions safely. It's how I understand what I want in this place. Cause everybody wanna tell you bad things, what could go wrong, what fame brings. But success is a finicky thing, and if you ain't sure, no, it'll never be.